Good afternoon and welcome to the Debut Spotlight. My name is Ellen Comisar and I am delighted to welcome Evanthia Bromiley, who has written a gorgeous book called Crown, just out on Tuesday. And we're going to have a great discussion with her once we get started with a little housekeeping. So welcome, Evie.
Thank you.
I'm going to turn off my phone now because I forgot to do that. So for those of you who are regulars at Blaze Nation, welcome back. We're always delighted to see you. For those of you who are new to Blaze Nation, let me just give you a little bit of background. We are a group of 30 creatives who came together at the beginning of COVID with the idea that writers should still remain connected to their readers and to the bookstores and vice versa. And we have been going strong ever since. We're now 5+ years into it. We have no intention of going away. So we're here to bring you all the great lit that's coming out. You can find us all over social media. We are on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and what we will always call X. So please follow us in those social media platforms, retweet us, like us, send us your comments. We're also, of course, on the web at www.amightyblaze.com, where you can find our schedule, a link to connect to our newsletter, which is a great resource, and all sorts of information about who we are. And of course, you can go on YouTube and find the full archive of our interviews, and this interview as well will be added to that growing list shortly after the show. So thank you so much for that. We are, of course, always accepting questions from our viewers. So if you have a question, please feel free to drop it in the chat and we will get to it later in the interview. So I am here with Evie Bromiley, whose first novel is Crown, with this gorgeous cover, which we can talk about later. And Crown is just a gorgeous poetic book. It has gotten a lot of praise already. Kirkus talks about it and says it lives within the rich tradition of literature and song of American struggle. This could be the story of the Dust Bowl, or a city shelter. Jude could be the mother in Dorothea Lange's indelible photo. It's a beautiful story rife with realism and hope, says Booklist. I'm going to just quote a few others because there are so many. It is a survival story of the first order. Evie is brilliant on the brutal poetry of daily life. The book is an epic of commonplace strife. It is concise, musical, propulsive, deeply humane, lyrical, unflinching, and emotionally compelling. That's a pretty good list, Evie.
It's very nice.
It's all true. So I really enjoyed reading this book, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. Let me also just give you a brief bio. Evie is a graduate of the Warren Wilson MFA program for writers. She's the recipient of scholarships from the Aspen Institute, a Lighthouse Fellowship, a Liesl Mueller Scholarship, and Elizabeth George and Carol Huck Smith Awards. She is the 2025 Grace Paley Fellow for Under the Volcano, which is an international residency in Mexico. And she was just there in January, so we'll be sure to talk about that. Evie's short fiction and creative nonfiction can be found in Agni, Prairie Schooner, 5 Points, and elsewhere. And Crown, of course, is her debut novel. So welcome, welcome.
Thank you very much, Ellen. Thank you for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. So in a very brief nutshell, can you give us a short description of what your book is about and who the characters are that we will come to love?
I can try. So the book takes place in, it's the story of a young family and the 3 days prior to the birth of a new baby and an eviction. It's a polyphonic novel, meaning that it's told in 3 different points of view. The first is Jude, who's a single mom and on the brink of eviction and very pregnant. And then her 2 10-year-old twins, Evan and Virginia, are the other voices in the novel. So Virginia is very much like the propulsion and the energy and the push, the physical push behind the prose. And then I think Evan is the daydreamer. And Jude herself, she's kind of the center of the triptych. She's kind of talking a lot about, well, she's, trying to keep everything together over the course of these 3 days.
Perfect. And somebody described the book as the intersection of poverty and motherhood, because we see this eviction is happening in basically a trailer park where Evie has set up home, where Jude has set up home with her 2 children, and they are surrounded by people whose names they don't really know, but who have, are sort of ever present in the background. And everyone's kind of aware that kids talk about, looking into the windows at night and imagining these other lives. And I guess that's mostly Evan who does that, the young boy. Mm-hmm. And one of the things these kids dream of and talk about is the absent father. And so you have this combination of this very present mother and the absent father. How did that play out in terms of developing the characters for Evie and Virginia?
I think with Evan and Virginia, they are very under-resourced. But in my experience writing the novel, as the characters came to life and became richer for me, I started to realize that imagination is a resource, and it's a resource that all children have. So as the characters came alive on the page, particularly Evan, the borders between what's real and what's imagined is pretty permeable. There's a real liminal space there. I also very much like that space in writing. So when I was writing Crown, I knew that the magic was happening when the book kind of took off in a way in which the children's fantasies almost bridged into their realities.
Right. There were times reading it, you don't quite know.
Yes.
The kids are at some point isolated and it's just the 2 of them. And you don't quite know, is this fantasy? Is this real? And it sort of goes back and forth. Like at first you say, oh, well, they're just imagining this. For example, the vent woman, who is, they're hearing this voice and it's a ghost and they're trying to figure out who it is. And then later Virginia sort of figures out who it is in the real world. But there's sort of this mixture of going back and forth, which is just, capturing this 10-year-old who's, they're on the cusp of knowing things, but they're still little kids who are make believe. They're still the kids who get in the boxes when they're moving and, pretend it's a train or pretend it's a boat, like a 3-year-old would. So it's sort of that interesting time in their lives as well. Did you think about putting them at a different age?
Ellen, that's a great question. I think they were always in the realm of 8 to 10. And I really like that you pulled from your reading this idea that the kids are at that liminal space between where the adult world is kind of the ceiling they're slamming up against, but their imagined worlds are very rich still, probably more so for Evan than Virginia. And I think when I was writing, that is just what I thought would be a thing that I thought would be really fun to play with. I thought, wouldn't it be fun to play with that liminal space between child and adult? And also what sharp contrast with Jude's world and what she's undergoing as an adult in these 3 days prior to the eviction and having a baby.
Right. She's very much grounded in reality. There's not a lot of gray space. She's got things that have to get done, dealing with where they're going to live, how they're going to live, how this baby is going to be delivered and where. So she has an agenda, even if at times people might think as a character that she's sort of a lost soul. She was a teen mother. And what I liked is that you really stepped away from the stereotype of a teen mother. You portray her, she's really the queen of the story. She's the one who primarily wears the crown. And when you think of teen mothers and poor teen mothers, she's not the welfare queen. She's the queen of the house. She's the royalty. And was that purposeful? In terms of, it could have been very easy to go the other way.
Yeah, 100% purposeful. It's very important to me as a writer to portray life as I really see it. So that I think that would be like my roots as a realist. And it was very important to me to not have Jude be a cliched character in any way. She's very powerful and
Yes.
she's adored by her children. And she's not a bad mom. She's just going through some systemic hardships that I think a lot of moms go through and remain relatively unseen. And so, yes, I never want in my prose any character to come off as cliched or with predisposed or like in crafting this novel and in all my writing, I aspire, for every sentence to be unique enough where the language is taking the character away from anything expected or not even expected, but preconceived, because that would be cliche. And to me, Jude felt very powerful.
She was. And you say, like, in your experience and from what you've seen, have you been either around this community or in the bureaucracy on the other side of it that's trying to help this community?
For 20 years, I've taught in public schools and Title I schools, which means that 40% of the population are receiving free and reduced lunch. I've lived and loved in the working class for a long time. And so, yes, I do have the personal experience, and also it's the act of imagination and the deep imagining that as a writer I prize the most. And so when I was learning to inhabit these characters, it took a number of years for me to fully find their voices. And I think that some of the uniqueness and the all-seeingness that I've heard people might be getting from this, and I'm grateful to hear that, is that it's just the act of imagination, which is so important to me as a writer.
Mm-hmm. Well, it certainly shows through both with your language and your sentence structure, but also with what comes through as your love, admiration of these characters. They're not characters that you're sort of, I'm writing them and I want my reader not to like them and not to feel empathy toward them.
Yes.
I think virtually every character, there's some way in which you feel empathy, even if the character is quite small and just appears in a very limited way. So I think that's a really beautiful thing. If you're just joining us, I am talking with Evie Bromiley about her novel Crown. Did you have anything to do with the cover or the title in terms of picking things?
So the title Crown is kind of multifaceted. It's when I was writing this book, and I do not believe this is important to readers to understand, but it was important to me as a writer. I was considering a crown of sonnets. And a crown of sonnets is a gift to the beloved. And I was considering the structure of the book in my head to be a gift to the unborn child that we're waiting for over the course of these 3 days. So there was that. And then there's also multiple references, metaphor, play on words involving like the crowns of trees where kids are hiding, or them pretending to be some kind of royalty in their little world. And also the way their mother sees them as two children with, kind of unlimited potential, and allows them to believe that. I think that was really important to Jude's character too, is that she doesn't crush, while she may be very matter of fact and the prose is really straightforward, she's also never crushing their imagination or their potential for dreaming.
That is true. That's true. I like one quote that I came across this morning as I was rereading is Jude saying, "There are many things wrong with me, but I can give a child a river." And they live close to the river, and the river is both comes across in metaphorical ways, importantly, as well as plot devices. Can you talk a little bit, the environment and the landscape and the plants and the trees all play this almost like an additional character. How did you get that detail in? Is that your background, where you live? Is that an area of interest separate from writing?
I live in the Four Corners, which is the corner of Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah. And so the landscape here is wildly diverse. You can be in the desert in a couple hours. You can be 14,000 feet in the San Juan Mountains. I live right next to the Animas River, which is a gorgeous, undammed river, just full of life. And I always... when I was a kid, I think this is kind of interesting because this has showed up in my writing. It wasn't something I consciously approached. My dad would name for me like the things of the wild, like the real names for things. And that naming has seeped into my fiction. I think real concrete nouns and naming plants and trees and rivers and the things of the wilderness is really important because when you name them, you put yourself on the same level and kind of assess that interdependence between the human and the non. And so that has kind of been something that's always been in my prose. And yes, all those plants and animals and things are here. They're in my backyard. It's a very Southwestern set.
And both Evan and Virginia, we first see them at the very beginning of the book, and they're coming home from having been out in the fields and playing and getting muddy. And that plays a central part. They escape into these areas. They encounter some fears and dangers in those areas later in the book. So it was very much, and their last name is Wood. So they're very much part of it, which I found to be just, that was like this little subtlest, connection, but they are very much at home, even in the wilderness, even while they're seeking a home. And so there was that just nice balancing between the two, which I thought was great.
Yeah. Thank you.
So I just want to step back. You talked about you've been writing these characters for a few years and, they grew on you. What was your process like? When did you start working on this? What's your writing style like, your day? And then how did you make that leap from aspiring novelist to published novelist?
Okay.
It's a lot of questions there.
Yeah, I think the seeds of the novel there's a scene in the book in which Virginia, the little girl, is standing at the edge of a grass fire, and she's kind of racing the fire while the ranchers are burning the fields and prepping them for planting. And I saw this little girl and I wanted to find out her story. And so that was the seed. I wrote to find out who loved her and what she was afraid of. And I began the book at Warren Wilson in my final semester when I was writing my thesis. And it was in a very different shape and form than it is now. And it was very wild. And I think that's when I knew maybe, and that's been my experience with the book I'm working on now too, that though it started out as kind of a giant mess of impressions or this like stack of images that needed a lot of shifting and moving, I knew that it was real because it was like improvisation, pulling from these images. And that was kind of the defining image of the novel. And then, Ellen, I forgot this second. Oh, my writing process every day. Every day I wake up early and I walk the dog along the Animas River, and I come back to my studio and I write new work here at home where it's quiet. If I'm in a later part of the novel, I go to a very busy coffee shop in town where there's a lot of external noise and busyness, and I can zone right in there too. So I can really write pretty much anywhere. Unless
why do you make that shift but what does being in that loud, busy place help you do that you don't think you could do in the quiet of your writing space at home?
I think when I'm dreaming up the story, the initial scenes and images, it's important to have silence.
Okay.
Because the prose is kind of creating its own music, and I write a lot by sound and image.
Yes, you do.
Yeah. And then later on in the day, if I'm going to continue to sit down and write and make myself do that, if I'm at a table in a coffee shop, that noise kind of presses in on me. And sometimes when you're writing a book, I'm sure you've experienced this, it's like everything from the world seeps into the novel when it's going well. And so the coffee shop can be helpful for that too.
Okay.
Not to mention, I'm a great lover of cortados. Like I love caffeination.
Always good.
Yes.
So how long ago so you started this when you were in your MFA program. How long was it until you then were ready to look for an agent? And
it took me 5 years to write the book. I was writing very early in the morning when I was working full time, before my daughter woke up and needed to be at school and before I had to go to work. And so this book took a while.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it's almost like, Grace Paley talked about how she wrote at the kitchen table on the backs of receipts and things. This book is written in very short vignettes. It's almost like Polaroids, holding a stack of images in your hand. So I think you can tell that was my time frame, or I can, looking at it.
Did you always plan to write it in these 3 voices with these sort of short vignettes, or was there a time where it took a different form?
That's a great question. There was a time when it was omniscient, the entire novel,
Mm-hmm.
and I was kind of seeing it through the eyes of the park.
Oh.
And members of the park as kind of the chorus.
Mm-hmm.
And that omniscience later on in the structuring of the novel didn't serve the material. It was such an intimate story about a mom and her 2 children and the land they live on that I decided that this polyphonic way of talking about the novel was a much better way to do it. At the beginning of the book, inside the front cover, there's the first page is a dramatis personae, right. And it kind of tells you how to read the novel, who the primary characters that you will be moving between are.
Right.
So it's almost the architecture just became a little bit more dramatic, like more like a play.
Mm-hmm. It functions that way, little scenes one after the other. Did you write sort of, I'll say front to back, in the sense of, the stories are all interspersed? Did you write, like, for example, a long section of Virginia and then say, okay, this is really 4 sections and this is how they slide in? Or did you like sort of do the sliding in as you were writing?
Sliding in as I was writing, it was very improvisational and kind of, it's like intuition wise, I would know when one voice was ready to be quiet and let the reader pour herself in. And then the next voice was ready to come in, and also what the texture and the energy might be between the 2. So that's another reason that it's written the way it is because in those in-between spaces, it gives the reader an opportunity to feel something.
Yes, very much. We fall in love with these characters very much. And did you do anything exciting for your pub date, which was just Tuesday?
Last week I was at Lighthouse Writers Workshop, and I was across the seminar table from Paul Harding, which was very exciting for me because he's a hero of mine. He's got Tinkers is just beautiful. And I did some interviews and some things while I was in Denver. I was with Mitzi Rapkin on First Draft. And
from my hometown.
Oh, really?
Yep.
Wow.
She's from Rochester.
Yeah. And so that was really fun to be in community with other writers. I found this debut journey so far, which granted I haven't been on it very long, to be really relational and really about being in community with other writers and readers, and bookstores, like indie bookstores. I've stopped in a bunch of bookstores. My home bookstore, Maria's Bookshop in Durango, we're having a big party next week, and there'll be live music, and I just expect it to be a very Durango event. Yeah. So it's been really fun so far.
That's great. And you mentioned that you were in Mexico for the Under the Volcano international workshop. Can you talk a little bit about what you were doing there and what that experience was like, given that you were months away from publication?
Yeah. I brought my new novel there to work on, and I can't sing enough praises about Tepoztlan, which is it's an hour outside of Mexico City in the mountains. In this little town it's just a very beautiful old cobblestone streets Mexican town And Under the Volcano is a residency in which some of it's bilingual. So there's Spanish and English speaking writers in all the genres. So there's poetry, there's fiction, there's journalism. And Mexican journalists are to be greatly admired. It's a very risky and prestigious job. And creative nonfiction. And I would there was so much time to write. I would sit at this beautiful old hotel on top of the mountain, and I could look down at the valley, and every neighborhood in the town has a church. And so starting at 8:00, they would start ringing the bells. And once one church starts, another one talks back and starts ringing, and then another one and another. And I think that just gave this new book such an aura of, it just felt sacred to work in that place. It was very, very beautiful. So I would recommend Under the Volcano highly. I met a lot of wonderful writers, a lot of wonderful friends. I really expanded my canon, like all the works in translation that I'm reading now, I heard about there. I was with a wonderful, wonderful writer, Ayşegül Savaş. She's a Turkish writer and a wonderful teacher. Her book, The Anthropologist, is absolutely stunning. So yeah, I really loved being in Mexico.
It sounds that way.
Yeah.
So the musicality of the bells brings me to my next topic, which is sort of this concept that was referred to in so many of the blurbs that I read and early reviews of the poetry of your language. And I noticed one sort of repeated style that showed up in many of your sentences. And I'm not sure what to call it, so I'll just give a couple of examples.
Sure.
You talk about the kids waking up in the morning and being cotton kissed, hyphenated, and the trees that are white and tremble hot, hyphenated, and a train that is coal driven, and how somebody gut laughs, as opposed to just laughing or having, you know, a deep laugh or, their laugh rising up from their gut. Was that concision and tightening of words something that you worked on consciously? Is that sort of just how you thought of these characters as they were being developed?
What a wonderful question, Ellen. I don't think it was a conscious craft decision. I think it comes in part from my voice. The spareness of the language.
Yes.
That is revision. That is going back again and again and again until a sentence does the unexpected, or a sentence turns on something that I didn't recognize as true, but then the language kind of tells me it is. And that's kind of what I love about writing.
Now, have you done poetry as well, or is this just sort of do you just have a poetic voice?
Oh, thank you. I have not written poetry. At Warren Wilson, where I got my MFA, you attend all the poetry lectures and all the fiction lectures. And I think that's an incredibly well-rounded way to look at Master of Fine Arts. So, and I also am really moved by poetry. I have Marie Howe's collected works behind me, and I adore it. I love poets. So yeah, I do attend to language. I love language.
I know some writers who will start their day as their writing day by reading poetry, that it just somehow unlocks something.
Yes. Yeah. And I think for me, there's lots of a writer friend I know calls it like the lighthouse texts you have, and they're not always texts. For me, sometimes getting my inspiration going is poetry. Sometimes it's animation fascinates me. Like Miyazaki's work, I think, is startlingly beautiful, and artistic and everything. His way of storytelling with that like seminal image and then building and building and building, or a work of like visual art. All those things can spur some good thinking.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about suspense, because we have this plot. We have a mother getting ready to give birth, facing eviction. We have her 2 children. And throughout, as a reader, I was nervous. I didn't know. And there was this, even in some of the scenes which are flashbacks, when Jude is in a car as a child with her father, and there's some sort of an accident, and you don't know in that moment what's happening. There's sort of that push-pull of, we know what's happening. We know she's going to have this baby somewhere, somehow. I'm just sort of curious, like, how do you thread in that suspense? Which, I mean, it was really propulsive because you had to find out, well, where are these kids going to go live? What's going to happen when they go to social services? Are they going to get an answer that's satisfactory?
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. I think the propulsion that I've heard the book has and the suspense that the book has is coming from a couple different engines. The first is this like highly compressed time frame of 3 days. The second is that much more technical and took a lot of thinking and work on my part. There's a space between what the children understand and what the reader herself understands and what the narrator is kind of telling you. And that space makes the reader, my hope is that it makes the reader much more aware of the dangers that are at hand with these kids than the kids themselves are.
Yes.
And what that allows the plot to do, or the book to do, is to allow you to be very worried, but there also to be moments of kind of startling joy and make the experience not bleak, not, I thought, wouldn't it be fun to write about how imagination is a resource for children? And that if we can preserve that kind of dreaming, how really life is just the stories we tell ourselves. And they're telling themselves some pretty hopeful stories. But you as the reader are seeing things as an adult and saying, oh,
That's not going to happen.
Children in the river at night.
That's a good example.
I don't feel comfortable with this train rushing.
I don't feel comfortable with leaving children in a car.
And you don't want your reader to be comfortable, because then they stop turning pages. You know,
I definitely kept turning pages as I read Crown, which is Evanthia Bromiley's wonderful debut, and it has sort of a corrugated cardboard crown and 3 birds on the front, and is just a beautiful lyrical book out this week. The other thing is, and we'll move on to some viewer questions soon, is that I really liked all of these side characters, both the people who live in the same trailer park and who are sort of in the background at various, for most of the novel, and then sort of poke up out of the grass and show their heads and take an important role, but especially the people at the hospital. While Jude is waiting to give birth, she's dealing with bureaucracy once again, dealing with some of the reality of being a young, impoverished mother who hasn't paid attention to all the paperwork involved. And she meets a couple people. She meets an old lady. She meets a young boy. She meets a sort of standoffish nurse at the counter. And she meets a doctor who is just the opposite. Were those characters, they're all very different. And they arrive late in the book. And without giving anything away, how do those interactions did you want to affect Jude or to affect the reader as we're coming toward the final scenes of the book?
I loved when those characters appeared in my subconscious and came and sat down.
They're great.
In my mind, very much. Dorothy, who's the elderly woman, she's at the end of her life while Jude is bringing new life into the world. And there's a juxtaposition there in which Jude was able to share a few like very tender moments with this elderly woman who also, like Evan and Virginia, is moving into an imaginary state of her life.
That's great.
Yeah, but also has quite a bit of wisdom. And the doctor and the nurse are supplementary characters, and they kind of the doctor's very kind, you know, doing her best work and the important work that doctors do. And the woman at the desk is pretty exhausted, is how I see her. But then I think most resonant for me was Simon, who kind of took up space in my subconscious and just sat down. That's the young boy. He's an addict that sits down next to Jude. And Simon is the first character in the novel that Jude really does reveal herself to. And as her labor progresses, she becomes more vulnerable. And she's in this stasis of this very starched antiseptic room of the hospital, but Simon is there. And the interactions between them struck me as like the very important interactions that we have on a day-to-day basis with strangers. And all the characters in the book that appeared as strangers became something different in this novel. And that was, that also is the gift of writing. I mean, when someone just shows up on the page and threatens to take over your story, and you have to rein them in and stop them from doing that, that's just the greatest joy.
Even the people waiting at the bus stop, you just had this little glimpse, and then they were just so beautifully rendered. And the interactions, much like the reader's interaction with the character, just had a real staying power. And I think these characters are going to stay with me for quite some time. We're talking to Evanthia Bromiley, whose book Crown came out from Grove Atlantic on Tuesday, and I'm delighted to get to talk to her in publication week. I understand we have a couple questions. If there's time, and if you're okay answering this question, what is your favorite treasure on the bookcase behind you?
It changes.
That's from Robin Stull.
Thank you for that question, Robin. It changes all the time for me. A book that I think is it's really hard for me to choose one.
You can choose a couple.
Okay, great. I'm going to choose two. A book that's really important to me right now is Ilya Kaminsky's Deaf Republic. I think it's a really important book for us to be looking at right now. The language is precise.
He's for those who don't know, he's a Ukrainian poet primarily.
He's a poet, and Deaf Republic is actually structured like a play.
Okay.
And it's absolutely heart-wrenching and gorgeous. You could read it in one sitting, which is one of my favorite things about. I love books that you can sit down and read in one sitting. I think Claire Keegan is one of my much admired mentor authors that, she also writes very small, gorgeous little books that are deeply emotionally affecting, but the prose is not sentimental. So Claire Keegan, I know I have all her things. And then finally, I would say Marguerite Duras. I'm really obsessed with The Lover right now. Just the way it's written is so feminine, and it's such a female book. And I think it's so powerful. She's so unafraid, and her prose is just gorgeous. So I would say those three, but I mean, we could talk about Amy Hempel. We could talk about Cheever. We could talk about Grace Paley, Elena Ferrante. I have lots of good books.
It's always something that our viewers enjoy, is getting book recommendations and understanding what books have inspired the authors who we bring on the blaze. So we have another question. What do you look for in choosing a book to read?
Voice. I read the first page of a book immediately. And I can always tell. It's a voice that I'm going to go to sleep and be dreaming in that style. I know it's a book I want to read. So voice would be first. There are books I read because the craft tools are helpful to me at a certain point in writing, like structure-wise too.
Great. Other questions? Can you talk about what you're working on now?
That's a great question. And I think the answer is it's not ready to be talked about yet. I don't want to dispel the the mystery that it's still giving back to me. And I also don't want to be inarticulate. So I appreciate that. But I do have actually 2 projects very kind of close to being able to talk about them. But
and are we soon to, are you at the point where they're heading to your agent? Has your agent already queried them?
No, not yet.
So,
no,
all right,
I'll give it to her when it's polished.
Okay,
I won't do that until
something for our viewers to look forward to.
No.
Finally, what writing advice would you give your younger self? And I'll expand that to say, what writing advice would you give to people who aspire to be, like you, a debut novelist?
I think read everything. Read works in translation. Read widely, and sit down every day to write has been like that for me, has made a book happen. I don't think it's the case for everyone. It's hard to give advice because everybody's artistic process is so different. But I do think for me, if I hadn't been dedicated enough to get up every morning and write and actually sit down at the desk, the book wouldn't have happened.
Where does that discipline come from? Are you disciplined in other ways in your life, or is it just in your writing?
Yeah, I'm a little nuts. Yeah. Like I'm disciplined physically too. I like boxing and weightlifting and being in my body. And I'm disciplined about those things and eating and yeah.
Okay. Apparently we have one additional question coming in, so we will continue.
Okay.
Any chance you would read the first sentence of your book now? In fact, I just opened it up to get to it because I was page 3.
Yes, I can do that.
You can read a couple sentences if you'd like.
Okay. The sun sinks low as I follow my brother up the deer path from the river. We slash through reed and cattail taller than our heads and climb. Sagebrush explodes with little brown birds at the top, and we don't stop. We don't say anything when we see the sheriff's car crawling slow on the dirt road below.
Right away, we're taken in. We know who's our characters are. We know there's some point of tension, and the writing is gorgeous from the start. It continues to be that way throughout the book. I guarantee those of you who have been fans of Debut Spotlight and fans of The Blaze will not be disappointed with Crown by Evanthia Bromiley, Evie, and it's just a beautiful, lyrical, poetic, propulsive novel, and I wish you all the luck with it, Evie.
Thank you so very much for having me.
My pleasure. So thank you. We hope our viewers will continue to follow us. Look for all of our interviews on YouTube. Get the newsletter. You'll always be informed about what shows are coming up next. My next show will be July 10th, also at 2 p.m., when I will be interviewing debut novelist Loretta Rothschild, who has an exciting book called Finding Grace. So we'll see you then. Thanks so much. And keep reading.